The Retreat. Grace, Part 2. Grace couldn't deny that despite her brusqueness, Rainey Wilson was dynamite with her kids. Tess, in particular, was smitten with her. But what really stood out about Rainey, other than her possible diagnosis on the spectrum, was the fact that she could communicate with Mavie in a way that Grace couldn't. This was first evidenced when Rainey came up to Grace, who was watching Tess go down the slide, and said, "Mavie feels tired and would like to have a snack." "Oh, did she tell you this?" Grace asked. Mavie had yet to speak a word, even to Grace. Most of the time, Grace just guessed what she wanted by what Tess wanted at the same moment. Usually, the only way that Mavie communicated was by crying. "No, I can just tell," Rainey said. "Oh, okay," Grace said skeptically. "So, can we get a snack from the bag?" Rainey asked, looking at Grace like she was an idiot. "Oh, yes, of course. It's on the picnic table under the shelter," Grace said, and she watched Rainey effortlessly take Mavie's hand to lead her toward their stuff. Mavie was extremely frightened of strangers, and Grace had never seen her hold anyone's hand but Tess's or her own. And sure enough, as soon as they reached the bag and Rainey dug out a snack, Mavie sat next to her, happily munching on goldfish. Now Grace was annoyed. How was this teenager, this child, so effortlessly connecting with her girls? She reminded herself she should be grateful. Usually a trip to the pool with the girls made her feel like a chicken with her head cut off. Grace caught someone moving toward her out of the corner of her eye. It was Kara Burkhart from down the street with her son, Riot. Grace inwardly groaned. Kara was one of those granola mommy bloggers that drove Grace nuts. She was constantly posting, preaching, on her Instagram and TikTok accounts. Grace was disturbed by her willingness to use her own child as a farm for online content. She wore matching Lululemon jogger sets and was dairy and gluten-free. She was an avid breastfeeder and supporter of La Leche League. She once told Lacey that Riot didn't stop breastfeeding until age 4. And she had a bumper sticker on her car that read, "Breast is best." And all of this would have been just fine and dandy if she wasn't so condescending. Grace said a silent prayer of thanks every day that Riot was older than her girls. He was 6 to the twins' 3. Otherwise, she would feel pigeonholed into playdates. But that didn't mean that Kara didn't regularly try to hang out with Grace. Grace did her best to avoid her. Kara also had a 15-year-old daughter, Tinsley, from a previous marriage. Kara was constantly offering up Tinsley as a babysitter, which Grace appreciated, but she knew she would never let Tinsley near her daughters. In her previous life as a counselor at the middle school, Grace had heard lots about Tinsley's ruthless bullying of the other girls, and even some boys in her class. Thankfully, Grace hadn't been assigned as Tinsley's counselor herself. She imagined that Kara was one of those parents who assumed everyone but her own child was in the wrong. "Hey, Grace, long time no see. If I didn't know any better, I'd guess you were hiding from me," she said, baring her impeccably straight, white teeth. Grace gritted her teeth in a smile. "Who, me? Never." "Who's that with Mavie up there?" Kara asked. Grace debated whether or not to tell Kara the truth. Would Kara judge her? Of course she would. That was the worst part about becoming a new mom. Suddenly you gave the world about 100 more reasons to judge you as worthy or not. But what Grace really worried about was that Kara would be offended. Grace had turned down Tinsley 100 times, but she was willing to accept help from a complete stranger? In the end, she decided the truth was best. Maybe it would finally send a clear message. Her name is Rainey Wilson. Apparently, she just moved in down the street, in the Madigan's old place. And Kara paused, waiting for Grace to fill in the blanks. Babysitting? She said she needed a job this summer. Grace looked down at her feet, which had suddenly become very interesting. "Ah, how nice of you," Kara said, and Grace detected a hint of ice. "You know, Tinsley got a job lifeguarding over at Woodrow Hills," Kara said. Grace knew she was supposed to be impressed. Woodrow Hills was the private country club on the other side of the lake. Instead, she inwardly rolled her eyes, thinking about Tinsley Burkhart getting paid $18 an hour to scroll TikTok while elderly patrons swam laps and trophy-wives sunbathed. "Hey, isn't today the first day of the busy season over at the retreat?" Kara asked. "Sure is," Grace said. She was about to tell Kara that she needed to run when she heard a commotion beside her. Tess was shrieking. Riot looked at the two moms sheepishly, clearly having pushed Tess. Grace's mama bear started to activate, but before she could say or do anything, Rainey Wilson came out of nowhere and had Riot Burkhart by the arm. "Don't you ever do that again, do you hear me?" she snarled at Riot. Riot started crying. Kara rushed over to help him. "Excuse me, get your hands off my son," she shouted. Rainey stared her down, unflinching. "It's not good to push other people. He needs to know that," Rainey said, and her earnestness touched a soft spot in Grace's heart. "He does know that. I taught him that, thank you very much," Kara said. "Well, clearly you didn't do a good job," Rainey said. Grace summoned all of her strength to suppress a guffaw. The irony of all ironies was Kara Burkhart, parenting expert extraordinaire, being chastised by a 13-year-old girl from poor parenting. Kara looked at Grace expectantly, eyes wide. Grace cleared her throat. "Rainey, that's enough. I'm sure Riot is sorry, and we don't need to overreact," Grace said. Rainey looked at her like she was a traitor. Kara huffed away, and Grace sidled up next to Rainey and the girls. "Pushing is wrong. He needs to know that," Rainey said. "Why did you not even make him apologize?" "I know," Grace said patiently. "Some things just aren't worth it," she said. "You said I overreacted," Rainey said. Grace could see the hurt in Rainey's eyes. "You didn't overreact. I'm sorry I said that. Kara's just She hesitated to find the appropriate word. "A butthead," she finished. "You lied," Rainey said, but she couldn't help but smile at the butthead comment. "You're right, I did lie, and I'm sorry about that." "You did good," Grace said, putting a hand on Rainey's shoulder. Rainey immediately moved away. "I don't like to be touched," she said. Grace nodded. She felt that way a lot these days, too. "Okay, Rainey, you're hired. How does 2 days a week sound to start? Tuesdays and Thursdays. You come help me in the mornings up until nap time at noon?" Grace offered. Rainey nodded in response. "All right, great. How much is your rate?" Grace asked. Rainey shook her head. "I don't want your money." Grace was puzzled. "Isn't that the whole point of getting a job?" she asked. "Not for me," Rainey said, and without a word, she walked away.